sticks, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Warndorf, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University. And today, I'm interviewing Lainey Newman, co-author of the new book, Rust Belt Union Blues, Why Working Class Voters Are Turning Away from the Democratic Party, from Columbia Press. Lainey is a JD candidate, as a matter of fact, in her second year at Harvard Law and a graduate of Harvard College. Lainey, welcome to The Politics Guys.
Thank you so much, Trey. I'm so pleased to be here.
Well, I have to be honest, I was really excited to be the author or the host that was going to get to do your guys' book. I'll be honest, I'm a little bit of a fan of your co-author. Obviously, I didn't know you, but when I was in graduate school, as a matter of fact, I have it behind me. We actually went through Skocpol's book. And so I couldn't help but be a little bit like, in that case, that was State and Social Revolutions. It was a primary text for us. Did she teach her own books at Harvard? Did you get to do her own things? Or is she one of those who kind of shies away from her own work?
She offers samples of her work. I took, when I was an undergrad, I took her seminar on American inequality. And she incorporated a lot of different source material and didn't only sort of focus on her own work, but from time to time she will assign her own content, which I think is great because she's obviously incredibly accomplished and has written on a range of topics, comparative politics to, of course, the Tea Party and now unions. So
right. Well, and you too. And so I'll be honest, as a professor, that was the other thing that struck me by the book. And I was just so excited to see, here is a late career professor working with an undergraduate at the time on this text. And so I was wondering, could you kind of talk to me about, that doesn't happen every day. So how did the two of you end up working on this project together? What got you to work on a book with Skocpol?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a crazy process, and I'm still shocked that there's a book out there with my name on it. So you're not the only one.
Well, congratulations on that.
Well, thank you. So I had been a research assistant for her for a good bit of time in college. And then when it came time to write my senior thesis, I approached her. I was hoping to write on unions and political realignment. I come from Pittsburgh, where, there's been a lot of union presence and over time. And I have extended family members who were in the auto workers union, which currently is, of course, in the news. And so I wanted to look at sort of why a lot of union members in the Rust Belt were no longer voting for Democrats, particularly in these, industrial or ex-industrial areas. And so I had taken her course and been her research assistant, and I approached her. I know that she does a lot on sort of social networks, and so I thought that it might be a good fit, thinking about unions as, one of the civic organizations that were, really strong in the mid 20th century. And she accepted, and we began working together. And so for the next year or so, I was writing my thesis and did some of the sort of groundwork of the book that is now that has now been published. And then after that thesis was finalized, and I had gone graded on it and whatever, there was some talk in the Gov department about it, and she asked if I'd want to continue working on it and try to sort of expand the scope of the argument. And so I decided last minute to defer law school for a year to see, where this new project would go. And I jumped in. And so that for the following year, then we were working together on the actual book that you read. So that was sort of how the whole thing played out.
I love it. I mean, I just love the fact that that's how you guys connected. That is such a fun connection with your mentor that you're working on. But I also say that's brave on your part, delaying law school. That's a big deal. And I mean, that had to be a little nerve-wracking.
Yeah. I actually, it was a very sort of, I've been risk averse my whole life, and so I think that it was a little bit out of the path of least resistance, I think. But I'm so glad I did. I'm glad that I took the risk, and I learned so much throughout the process beyond just beyond actually publishing the book, but having the experiences just has been invaluable. So yeah.
Well, I'm glad you took the risk too, because then I wouldn't have got to read this book otherwise. And I think this is some really excellent scholarship. I just want to start with that.
Thanks.
And so, I know we're going to get some in the weeds, but I always kind of like starting when I'm interviewing authors to just kind of do the summation. So I'm going to try to sum your book up a little bit here.
Yeah.
And then you tell me how wrong I am. Okay. And then you fill in the gaps, right? I'll be the student.
Okay.
So if I was going to do this to listeners and you were on the show, I would say, look, the paradox at the heart of your book is, how can Union country be Trump country? You were kind of getting at that even earlier. And it seems to me, as I've read your text, is that the answer is we need to look at what a true Union man was. And when you look at what a true Union man was, by the mid-20th century, he is primarily, as you guys argue, this dense web of social connections, and voting Democrat is part of that web of social connection. And so then as unions begin to break down, those webs are replaced by other groups that include the Tea Party and gun clubs. And therefore, the ideological positions that the Union man had before then come out differently, because those identities are primary in these new social webs. So in short, social connections drive those deep political outcomes. So the people are more or less the same, but the outcomes are different because those webs being different. How did I do?
That was beautiful. I think that's better than I could have done.
Okay, I'll take that.
Yeah. No,
listen, I still like getting my A+ and when I can.
Yeah, exactly. No, that was a great summation. I would just add that I think, we look at not only unions, but these other organizations that were present in union communities, and how influential they were, and how, union members influenced one another. And it was never really about sort of the top-down instruction to vote Democrat. It was more about reinforcing those sort of mutual networks and mutual relationships throughout the community. So, in a lot of ways, I think that you completely, hit the nail on the head by saying that the people maybe haven't changed. It's just these networks and these communities really have.
No, and I kind of loved that your take on that. And so to kind of get into some of the questions about the book and kind of as we move forward, one of the things that you hammer, Lainey, again and again is that, union workers, they always had these other ideological positions. So, they were largely often gun owners. They often had, and you guys go into some detail on this, had some pretty sexist and racist views. But because of this social web, right, and part of that web, and you're right, it's not just unions, but it's kind of more local churches and these other local entities. It prioritized their advocacy different. So talk to us a little bit about this concept of how social ties drive politics and for listeners, and kind of lay out that argument.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that both Theda and I come from a place of believing that, our surroundings the realities that we experience, our circumstances, the networks that we're part of shape not only our political views, but also our sense of self. And so I think that, what we were looking at is when those things change, when circumstances, surroundings, networks change, what is the impact on the outcome, which is in our case, in our book, like voting trends. And so I think that our argument is that social networks, the groups that we're part of, influence us, whether we think that they do or not. And when those groups change, so can our beliefs. So I think that underlying that whole idea is just a sense that identity is something that is adaptable, right? So our social identities are adaptable. They respond to our environments. And so, yes, when people were getting messages not only from conservative groups or entities, but also from more liberal groups, and really valued their membership in those groups, and derived value from that, from those groups. That served as a counterweight to some of those more conservative influences. And as you said, there's always been a lot of sort of conservative cultural views amongst this population. And the thing that's different, that we've noticed, is that, what are the groups that are still present, and what are the influences that are still there? And so, there's a huge difference now compared to several decades ago. So that sort of, I think, lays out a little bit of the theoretical underpinning of our argument.
Now, I'm going to be honest, right? I mean, the other area that was something that I really focused in on was I teach data analysis. And so I am I'm a mixed methods guy, right? I love qual, I love quant. So in my class, I teach both. And I know, in the academic world, I've already made like everybody mad, and that's fine. That's just the way it is. And it was so just apropos the timing of when the book came to me, because I was just telling my students, look, in the real world, you're either going to have to be a qual or you're going to have to be a quant, and it's kind of hard. And I was relaying some messages from graduate school on that front. And then just a few days later, as I get into your guys' book, and I thought, oh, here it is. Here's a mixed method. Here's a mixed method. This is where you're doing qual, you're doing quant. So I actually brought it to the class. I'm like, see, here it is. Here it is. This is what I was talking about. And so I was more excited than they were, I'm sure. But be that as it may, but for your book and for listeners, right? The thing that's really new is that you guys did 50 in-depth, open-ended interviews in Western Pennsylvania, right? And that in and of itself is kind of, I'm curious about. But what did those interviews look like? I mean, you kind of talked about that and lay it out in the book. But what even got you to doing the interviews as being the way at getting at these webs that you're talking about? Was it because it's the same people? I was just kind of curious how you got there. And then at the same time, because again, now we're going to get really wonky, right? How did you guys, once you decided to do the interview style, how did you remain neutral, that kind of scientifically scholarly method, because you're obviously going to know these people pretty well, given what I've seen from what some of those answers are in the book. So talk to us about, how did you get to those interviews? How did it end up being 50? Why 50? And, all the fun stuff that goes along with that.
Yeah, sure. Well, so I'm so glad that you thought that the book was a good example of combining the qualitative and quantitative methods. I think that both Theda and I think that the methodology has a lot of value. Each methodology and all the sort of sub methodologies within them offers a lot of value and insight into different perspectives on the same phenomena, right? And so when I started the project, Theda, before I sort of created a hypothesis or, really laid out my own, idea of what was going on, Theda said, go out and look at the data, go out and see what's out there. I remember her saying that. And so go see what's out there. And I think for me, I'm not a quantitative, computer science type person. That's my sister, actually. But I wanted to talk to people. I wanted to hear people's experiences, and I wanted to sort of understand from their perspective. And I think the best way to do that, from where I was coming from as a student, was to see, whoever could talk to me, I would talk to, and so I think that the 50, I think we had a couple more over 50. I think it was around 50. But we used we kind of tried to navigate different communities. And so when we talked to one person, we would say, hey, it's the snowballing method. Hey, is there anyone you know? Do you have a friend in the local that you could refer me to? And in that sense, there's a little bit of trust established by some sort of common, the go-between person, right? The middleman is someone who the next person knows. And sometimes it was, just reaching out to leadership to leadership of different local unions. And I started talking, my very first interviews were with some of the high-ranking members, so some of the actual leaders of an international, I won't say which one, but one of the large industrial unions. So I talked to those people on the sort of leadership, really high level first. And I was like, this isn't giving me what I need. I need to talk to the rank and file to figure out what really is going on. And so, trying to sort of just, I think that once you get in to one person, then it becomes a little bit easier. But there were people who sent me lists phone numbers and basically said, call my friend, Bob, Joe, whatever. So, referring me and to their friends and even to their family members. There were a couple people who I talked to who, father and son, both working at the same steel mill, not at different, actually overlapped a little bit, but at different points for the most part. And so, I think that, the interviews give a real sense of depth to the research, and then the quantitative can kind of supplement that with looking at some overall trends. So that's kind of how I would sum it up.
Was that something that was hard to do? Because one of the things that I had wondered about was, you're a woman, you're an academic, you're writing a book, and those aren't necessarily positions that are always going to be particularly like, oh yeah, I want to work with this person. Was it hard to do that? Was there a bit of a barrier? Were people maybe hostile at first? I could at least envision that. Yeah. You don't talk about that. I kind of wondered about that in that sense as well.
Yeah, I mean, there were some instances where people were pretty resistant, but for the most part, people were open with me, and I also felt that my identity as a student, as a young woman, was actually for the most part an advantage. Because people were willing to tell me things, honestly, that I don't know if I had been older or, I think that, establishing trust with the interviewees was really important. And so, really trying to build a relationship, honestly, that, I could, and sometimes I would talk to them multiple times or call them about a question later on. And so I think that people, appreciated, for a lot of people expressed their appreciation for me just being interested in what had been going on. And that's one of the things that, we look at in the book, which is that some of these people just feel like the history has been forgotten, like the steel, history and, the pride that a lot of people had in that has been sort of forgotten and overlooked. And so I think that a lot of people appreciated it. There were some people who were more, resistant to my questions, and I would just leave it. I wouldn't press people with being answering questions or even talking to me. If they didn't want to do it, then I wasn't, I wasn't going to try to force them or anything. There was a couple incidents where certain types of questions, I think, would get people a little bit, would frustrate people more. So, for example, when I was asking about, well, what do you think about, clean energy? That was one I remember quite clearly where the guy I was talking to got frustrated and got a little bit angry, I guess, about even, how people are talking about this. And it's, it's all just, buzzwords and not, doesn't actually help anyone in his community. But for the most part, I would say I had a really good experience. And I think that, being young, being a woman, being a student at the time for some of these interviews was helpful, honestly.
Okay, well, that I wouldn't have thought about that, but I can imagine maybe maybe even that you were kind of alluding there, might have said more than I would have if you had walked in and they're like, oh, this is going to be a story tomorrow or something, right?
Yeah, a journalist, or yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, so one of the things that kind of seems to be, your title is really about this, hey, how do you have this shift? And you get into that, and we talk about that. And for me, it really is that the idea that the union being a big part of that social web, those social connections are just such a big part driving political outcomes, voting in the case of the book. And so one of those major ways that you talk about early in the book is the evidence that unions lowered things like racism. And you even have this really wild interview quote, I had all these notes on, where there's this individual saying effectively, look, yeah, if it wasn't for the union, I would have been all about the KKK, And I'm just like, whoa, not what I was anticipating. And even if you thought that, I didn't think they would necessarily share that. So, it's always curious what people will share. And you point to how central that is. And so one of the things that I seem to be taking away from the book is look, Union Man was kind of a sexist, racist person, but the right kind of social connections with the union fixes that. So the problem, if you want to kind of put it that way, that your book is getting at is to say, well, look, here's the problem of the Trump voter is that individual doesn't have unions in the middle of his social web. Am I getting at that right? And is that kind of a call for the validity of unions as a mitigating factor against things like sexism, racism, et cetera?
Yeah, look, I think that, there's been a lot of research done on how unions, just as institutions decrease racism. And I think that, unions not only in the workplace, but working alongside people who, were your brothers and who were your equals and who you knew you didn't have to compete with for the next day's job, as some of my interviewees told me, definitely made people feel more trusting of one another, of people who didn't look like them. I would say, I think that, again, we think that everyone's beliefs are shaped to their environments and are influenced by their environments and surroundings, and the organizations of which they're part. So I don't know. I guess the underlying union man. I don't know if I could say whether that person, was or wasn't, a certain. I don't know if I could categorize them as, whether this person is sexist or racist. But I think that there are influences that can serve as a counterweight to those types of really pernicious, beliefs, right? And so I think that the union served as one of those counterweights. And when it went away, that affected how people viewed themselves in relation to society and in relation to their peers, and in relation to groups that they felt were the other, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. So again, I don't want to categorize, people as one thing or another, but I think that the union certainly served as a counterweight for a lot of folks that, when it started fading, that influence also faded.
Yeah, and to take it even maybe another bit of it is, as you had argued earlier on, it wasn't just the union, but it was kind of the union at the center of this web of connections. But as the union breaks down, the rest of that web really seems to potentially break down. Yes?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so, this was all coinciding with the decline in, fraternal groups and civic participation, and, small local churches. So, yeah, I think that, people felt more isolated in a lot of ways. And there's always going to be a need to feel, it's a human need to feel part of something or part of a larger group, larger sort of, just part of something bigger than oneself. And so I think that, when those types of really tight-knit communities faded away, the isolation and more conservative influences were able to take more, to have more weight, really.
And something else, it kind of relates to that, and then we can kind of change topics a little bit. And I've got it in front of me right now, as a matter of fact, is your book has just so many wonderful both the pictures of artifacts, but then also kind of the written material of artifacts. And I want to talk about both of those. And in the center of the book, you have all of these beautiful, Flood City from Johnstown, PA. And be honest, just to be clear with both you and listeners, all these mentions of Johnstown, I don't have any connections to Pennsylvania, but my wife does. And so I know tons of people.
Yeah.
And so I was very, I'm drawn to this in part because of that, on my wife's side of the family. And she was really interested in that too. But I couldn't then help noticing, again, I'm drawn to all of that. It was like 99%. That's not. I didn't actually do this. A lot of them. Let me be right first. A lot of them were from Skocpol's personal collection, and so I couldn't help but be left wondering a little bit, like, okay, so is it surprising that the scholar who collects all the Union materials, hooks up with somebody who's in Pennsylvania who's like, Unions and they broke down?
Yeah.
Given that your work is qualitative, how did you guys try to keep yourselves from beginning and ending with kind of that same goal that I know some of our listeners are going to think about, which is like, oh, okay, 2 more academics telling us that unions are good things. And they interviewed some union people. And of course, it was a good thing. So talk us through that a little bit, because even I was like, that's a lot of material from one person's library. So talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so Theda is a big fan of sort of collecting artifacts and antiques, and she scours not only the antique malls but also eBay. She's a big eBay, and so actually those things that we took pictures of, we got for the project. So
really.
So those weren't things that she had previous to actually us doing this research. And so in doing some of the research, when we would notice, in some of the materials, some of the, for example, like the newsletters that would talk about the pin, mentioned pins, dues checkoff pins, for example, dues paid by checkoff. And so then we looked for them, and that's sort of how that went. And so, and Theda does have a collection of more than 3,000 ribbons. That's one of her one of her passions. And so she has ribbons from all the fraternal organizations, and for the project started looking at union groups as well. So I think that, in that sense, those artifacts came really from the research itself, and from what we were noticing, from what we were hearing. A lot of the pictures that you see from newsletters, so of certain articles, like there was a couple about or images of union, like a union family or
yes.
So that was through something that some of the analyses that I had done in different union halls, essentially, of their newsletters. And so, and other ways, records that I had gotten from various university archives. And so that gave us a lot of context as to what these, what people were doing, what people were, these different things that people were involved in, like the different organizations that the union supported. And so that's sort of how we got started with those artifacts. I think that in terms of keeping ourselves isolated from beginning to end, I think that, Theda believes very strongly and instilled this in me in doing systematic social science research. So, social science research is never going to be, and qualitative research, I should say, is never going to be, a statistical matter. And that's something that she's told me. It's not going to be, a standard deviation type thing where you can pinpoint by a coefficient or whatever. But, it's important. It's always important in research to be systematic and to understand where your information is coming from, how it lines up with other sources of information. When we were analyzing, for example, the newsletters, looking at how we could compare them, that would sort of be a fair comparison between different newsletters that we had spaces in time, like some of them were from this year to this year, and some of them. So there are differences, of course, but the important point is finding out or figuring out a system and metrics that you can use across the sources and across the material. And so with interviews, that really, the way that worked was looking at trends in what people were saying. And so in my thesis research early on, what I did was I basically looked through I printed out the interview, the notes that I had from all my interviews, and I looked at where the commonalities were, and what, maybe what I should start looking at through the archival materials, what types of things we wanted to really zero in on, and sort of interrogate more. And so I think that with qualitative research, it's impossible to be as precise, I suppose, as in quantitative research. But you get a lot more, I think, out of sort of that rich analysis, and always trying to make sure that it's systematic at the end.
No, I'm actually, I mean, I'll even come out and just say that I think sometimes, especially in political science and in the social sciences in general, we have ended up kind of like econ making math God and stripping, the social element out of our studies a little bit. So I hear that. And so what I kind of hear you saying there is that the interviews, as you looked at them carefully, helped you both get more and structure the other material. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Totally. So sort of those early interviews, not so much with the leaders of the international, but when I started talking to members, and just here in, those early conversations, I don't even know if they were in, official interviews or not, but more just conversations that I was having with people, like just feeling, trying to figuring out what's out there, which is what Theda told me to do. She said, go see what's out there. So, and then looking at trends and patterns and what you can sort of extrapolate from those things.
I'm going to be honest. One of the things in your union writing material, and this kind of segues well into this, was the kind of the depth of some of the items that I saw. And I mean, obviously not all of it. I mean, like, for example, you get the rod and gun stuff, which is interesting, but it was much shorter. You have some pictures of that. But the one that just really struck me was that you have this one union publication that runs a series on knowing your government. And then in January of 1955, the particular article you're talking about is, know your government, the Justice Department. And I just about laughed out loud because I can't even imagine getting my intro class to read anything with the word Justice Department on it at all. And this is going out broadly, and it's kind of part of clearly this longer series, right? This is just one standalone piece in this larger series. And so, as a scholar myself who focuses on political communication, it seemed to me once again to kind of point to the fact that how much we're willing to read and do might have shifted. So, as you were looking at these artifacts, you talk about all these times. Did you notice a trend in the way that the communication was happening? Because again, I can't imagine a union sending that out today. I can't imagine any organization sending out something like that today and having it be read. Yeah. Did you see that shift over time in the union materials? Or talk to me about that. I was very fascinated by that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that, that was really interesting. I think that unions in that era really saw themselves as, it's emblematic of unions, serving not only as these economic units, but also as sort of real, providing education for the community, providing, information about services to the community, providing sort of a sense of, and reinforcing a belief in and a stake in government and civic participation. And so, it is interesting that there was such in-depth, and these articles about the Justice Department, the Department of Treasury, where it was a series, through these issues of, I think that was the IBEW's newsletter. And so I think that did change over time, and there isn't as much sort of interest or expectation perhaps of unions serving that purpose. Today, obviously, we're getting so much information from so many different sources. It's like source overload. Yeah. Whereas back in this era, this was one of the main sources of, people's information. It was the union newsletter and the labor. There was a labor newspaper in a lot of these towns as well that was sponsored by various unions that would, sort of chip in. And so I think that, it's representative of a different role that was being played made by that was taken on by unions in that era compared to today. And yeah, I think that things did change as we saw more options for where people were getting their information, and that's something that we didn't examine that closely in our research, but I think that is definitely there. As communication options expanded, the centrality of union communications definitely decreased.
And yeah, I appreciate that, because it was something that I think your book really suggested some more work in, with some of those trends. Mm-hmm. But if you just had to kind of extrapolate your hypothesis as you move forward, I mean, you talk about that kind of the bottom up versus the top down in unions. Do you if you were going to go out and do book number 2 and you were going to think about it on those fronts, do you think that might be part of the trend from the top down in unions? Was there's just not space for horizontal communication anymore?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, because I think that, as we've seen more sort of managerial and sort of administrative involvement of unions, as opposed to, the grassroots involvement that was really typical of the mid 20th century. There has been much more sort of mass communication, and via whether it's social media or I think websites and whatnot. But in general, and yet I think that the union's ability to access members and to communicate to members has decreased. So I think that that's an interesting question. I don't know how I would approach that. I think it's a good question, though. It definitely needs to be researched some more.
Well, I do love it. You've done good work when your work and your book points to the next set of things that needs to be done, right? You can never answer everything. It's unfortunate. So right. Now, the next portion of the book really delves deeply into the decline of unions, and you set this up as a kind of a culmination of regulation, economics, environmental regulation, and international changes. And it was kind of perfect timing in some ways, because my co-host Ken Katkin and I had just spent a better part of an episode here for Labor Day, as we do every year for the Politics Guys, assessing the state of labor. So I'd love for you to walk us through the decline of labor.
Wow, that's a big task.
Well, yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, wow. So there's been, I think, as we discuss in the book, there's been a lot of things that have sort of culminated in a decline over time. And now, obviously, we're seeing this potential resurgence, and that, it's up for debate as to how far that's going to go. But I think that, in the 1970s, 1980s, there was a lot of economic and political and regulatory changes that affected labor really significantly. So let's start, I guess, with, regulatory. I think that in the 1980s, there, with the Reagan era, there was a huge movement to deregulate, and yet in the previous to his era, there was a lot of regulation on the environment and an increase in sort of protection for that, which affected heavy industry like steel and coal, and is still affecting those industries today, probably more so than ever. And so, and you see over time the shift in reliance on domestically manufactured goods and products such as steel to internationally imported goods. So, for example, with steel, a lot of steel was being produced at the time in China and Japan, being imported. Now we talk about steel dumping, how basically subsidized steel from other countries just gets sort of thrown into the U.S. market without and priced at such a low rate that U.S. companies can't really compete. And so the increase in trade and globalization coincided with these regulatory changes that were going on. And then the economics, I think, with Reagan, there was an attack on labor that I don't think that the Republicans had had really ventured into yet. And Reagan started that era of unprecedented attacks on labor in trying to sort of undermine labor's role even at the table. Whereas previous Republican presidents had sort of, accepted and cooperated with the reality that labor was one of the key players. Reagan wanted to, and essentially was pretty effective at challenging that idea that the unions should be sitting at the table during these big decisions that were being made, and instead sort of really relied on corporate executives and financial advisors, and so. Yeah, that was. I think that it started then, and it's continued today. And I guess, we'll see what happens in these next several years. There's a lot going on right now, as we know, with labor.
Yeah, I mean, and I want to get to talk about some of the contemporaries on that as well. But to kind of back up a little bit to Reagan in that era, one of the items, and you're right, I mean, that there is an era where Republicans begin to shift and say, look, unions are part of potentially the problem when it comes to the decline of some of these industries. And so in the text, that does seem to be one of the areas that maybe you at least downplay. I looked at some of the IMF's, the International Monetary Fund's paper on the decline of steel, specifically in the United States. And, their analysis and your guys' analysis, not surprising, largely agrees. But there's this one last factor that they have that you guys don't have, which is kind of almost bolded. It was and by the way, the other big issue was labor unions drive costs way too high in the United States compared to other parts of the country. That wasn't kind of part of your argument, but do you think that is part of the problem? I mean, you seem to be kind of taking issue a little bit with Reagan there, and fair enough. But don't you? But could unions have been part of the problem as well, not recognizing that they were effectively pricing themselves out?
I mean, yeah. So I think that's an argument that definitely is valid, and that a lot of people advance in terms of that unions were part of the problem and maybe shot themselves in the foot a little bit, and were, I guess, in their unrealistic in their expectations in terms of pricing, getting priced out by other countries' industries. I think that we, focus on just another element of the conversation. Whereas I think that is part of it, part of the decline. It's just not something that that we're contributing to, I guess, I would say. So, I mean, I do think that that unions played a role, that maybe, in some cases we're not at the table and really willing to cooperate in sort of a fair and realistic way. But it's not, I guess I would just say that it's not something that we focus on in our book, just because it's I think that's more of an economics argument, whereas we're more looking at the sociological changes.
Yeah. I'll tell you, really, the only place where I had a spot where I thought, I'm not sure where I agree, and I was kind of looking at, it wasn't even quite there so much as when, as you get to the end and you're in that conversation about the declines of union, you effectively say, look, it didn't have to necessarily be this way, right? Elites could have better helped these corporations and thereby saved the unions. And again, I recognize there's some bias here too. The authors like Scott Linscomb have argued that, as a matter of fact, few other industries in American history have had a high as a prolonged subsidy as the U.S. steel industry, right? And yet they still failed. And even more recently, with changing things with NAFTA and Trump era tariffs, doesn't really bring about any major steals. And so I was a little bit skeptical that maybe, had it just been a little bit more protectionism, or as you guys allude to, had we had an Obama who was willing to bail out the steel industry the way that we bailed out the auto industry, this really would have saved unions. What do you think? I mean, do you really think more protectionism and subsidies really could bring back or have fixed that? Or is that But just talk through that a little bit, I guess.
Yeah. I think that's a very fair point. I mean, it's impossible to know, the counterfactual, whether something would have made the difference. And so I think that what we're sort of arguing is that different policy choices could have made a difference. And so, it was in the sense that inaction is action, right? And so in declining to sort of help out the U.S. steel industry and refusing to recognize sort of the eminent domain arguments that some of the steelworkers were making in Western Pennsylvania and Ohio about the steel plants that were shutting down. I think that had there been more support and had there been, sort of a different elite consensus, that could have led to different outcomes. I mean, I recognize your point that, there's been support for the steel industry. The Trump tariffs failed to bring back steel. I don't think that we're saying that things, you can forever prevent, the march towards progress. But I think that we are saying that there could have been very different realities. There could have been different lived realities for union members had there been different sort of decisions made by elites during these key moments. I understand your point for sure. But, I do think that the policy choices that are made impact what we've seen and which has been sort of the failure of U.S. manufacturing to even maintain much of a role at all on the world stage. And so, that's our perspective. But I understand your point.
Yeah. Now, this kind of brings us to the third half of the book, or the third half. Brings us to the final third of your book. I can do math. And, this is where you really start trying to look at what is the post-union union man looking like in that way. Mm-hmm. And you do some really, one of them was one of those moments that just seems so brilliant in retrospect. She's like, who wouldn't have thought of this? But of course, you guys thought of it, not anybody else. Were you doing these like bumper sticker analysis at a local USW parking lot? I thought, that was brilliant. It's to kind of get at that shift in those, that social shift among unions as unions decline, and kind of really trying to document that rightward, not maybe necessarily shift, but emergence, right, among the population. So, for the kind of data you were getting there, that qualitative data in the last third of the book, where you're doing things like the bumper sticker analysis, how did you get to that and walk listeners through, like, because you saw this shift towards Tea Party and gun clubs. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, so the bumper sticker analysis was pretty organic. I'll be honest. So I did a lot of research just during the time that I was doing thesis research, driving around Western Pennsylvania, walking around these different old mill towns, many of which are shells of their former selves. I talked to some shopkeepers. The pandemic made that a little bit hard, but you can still drive around, you can still take pictures and everything like that. And so, at one point I was just driving by a USW. I think that the first one that I did was the Edgar Thompson plant, which is in Braddock, PA. I was driving by and I saw the sign that said, employee parking, and that's sort of how that started. And so I thought, I wonder, if people are broadcasting their political beliefs with bumper stickers. And so I drove in the parking lot. It said no trespassing, but hey.
Listen, we're not in Pennsylvania right now. You're fair.
Right. Yeah. So I was just, and I started looking at bumper stickers. I really just was, driving through the parking lot and for a couple minutes really, and then left. And then I met with Theda, and I could just see when I told her, I looked at these bumper stickers, I took pictures, and I'm wondering, like, this seems like it's, really clear evidence of something that has changed. And, it seems like a real shift in not only people's politics, but also the willingness to outwardly express, something that is clearly an anti-union affiliation. And so, and she said, go, that's basically when we decided that I would go back and sort of do more of a systematic analysis of the numbers of the stickers, and also I looked at license plates, where people were from, and that type of thing. So that's how the bumper sticker analysis came to be. And I do think that it was a really interesting way, because we didn't do survey research. We didn't do, sort of a broad-based, type of poll within these different locals. It just wasn't something that was feasible within our time frame, or with what we were working with. And so this was sort of a proxy, an imperfect proxy for sure, but a proxy to understand how people were, people's political views, but also how people were expressing their views. And as I said, the willingness to take a stand publicly within the workplace, that was, that contravened the union's sort of outward policy objectives.
Now, I have to say, I mean, we couldn't have picked a better week to be talking about your book in a lot of ways, because, this is the week that President Biden has headed to the UAW picket line with striking auto workers, and he comes at an invitation of President Sean Fain. And then, of course, yesterday, Donald Trump, as a bit of his counter-programming for the second Republican debate, heads to Michigan, which isn't exactly where the book is located, but again, to some union country as well, to speak to union members. Even though in his case, he's not invited by the UAW leadership. And there was a lot of criticism. Rosenthal in Politico, in his opinion piece, was really critical of President Trump, basically just saying, look, all he's trying to do is, in his words, quote, hoodwink union members into believing he supports them, end quote. But, I had just read your book. And so all I could help thinking of was, I don't know, I think you might be wrong, Rosenthal, right? Because, all I could hear was, okay, so leadership in the union is inviting Biden, but they're not really connected necessarily with who their union members are anymore. And so, although I think a lot of people were really kind of critical, I thought, well, maybe Trump is, I hate to say this, because again, I'm not exactly a Trump fan by any means. Maybe Trump is right. What does your book tell us about what's going on this week, and about, I mean, again, your kind of initial response is to say, okay, this makes sense for Biden, doesn't make sense for Trump. But after reading your book, I can't help but say, maybe this makes a lot of sense for Trump.
No, I think that would be sort of my understanding. I think that Trump knows that the members don't always listen to their leaders, to the international leaders, and Trump has realized that with the steelworkers as well. I mean, when he was president, he invited members of the steelworkers. I actually talked to some of them who actually went to the White House, and for the signing of the steel tariffs, the imposing of the steel tariffs, and so he realizes that there's space and distance between the positions of the rank and file, and what the union leadership is, who the union leadership is endorsing, what the union leadership is saying, and so I think that reflects, him going to Michigan, I think reflects that he knows that he's in play there, right? And I think that in terms of Biden going to Michigan, and being the first president to walk the picket line, I think that Democrats have come to understand that they have to work for labor's vote, and that's something that for a long time I think Democrats took for granted, and realized probably in 2016, with the fall of the blue wall, or in the Rust Belt, that really we couldn't afford, or Democrats couldn't afford to do, and so I mean, it's a really interesting moment. I think that the UAW strike comes at a time where there's so much momentum and so much interest in unions and in labor, that it'll be really interesting to see sort of how this plays out, both for the union and for what they're advocating for, but also politically, as it's clear that the candidates are making this into an electoral issue as well.
Yeah. Well, I can't help but think, there again at the end of your book, where you talk about some current union members saying, look, one of the things that's so inviting about Trump specifically was, okay, I get he's not always doing what he wanted to do, but I feel heard, right? This is what I'm heard, even though there's not the outcome I'm always looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's it's something that is so simple, right? Yet it's so important that the leadership and the people who are trying to get someone's vote actually show up, right?
Yeah.
And try to understand what those people are experiencing and the hardships that they're going through. And Trump was capitalized on that in a very, very significant way. And I think since then, Democrats have been trying to understand how they can, sort of work backwards for working people and try to get people's votes back.
So as we kind of come to the end of the show, I'd love to kind of ask you a last question here. And that is, in many ways, I couldn't help but see, your book is for obviously a scholarly and a general audience, but you also seem to clearly be targeting unions themselves a little bit and saying, look, here might be ways you could do better. And I even hear that in your answer, like, okay, Democrats are going to have to think radically different about the overlooking working people in the Rust Belt. And so as I mentioned here earlier, we kind of do this recap on Labor Day every year. I'm curious, written the book, you've looked at all of this, you've talked to all of these individuals. So if I know this isn't going to happen, but if you got voted the next leader of the steel union or the the auto union, what actions would you either take or would you suggest if you were talking to that leadership again now to say, hey, look, here's what you need to do moving forward? Or do you think that decline is just kind of inevitable and behind?
Yeah, so I don't think that decline is inevitable. I think that, looking at some of the unions that have been successful, and one of the things that we do in the book is look at how the IBEW has been pretty successful in maintaining a sense of identity and loyalty. And I think that, so in response to your question, what I would do, I think that I would try as much as possible to invest in local leadership. I think that a lot of what happens in unions happens on the local level. And right now, I think unions have really large overhead, so administrative, a lot of money and time and resources going into the administration of the union. So I think one of the things that I would do is sort of try to reduce that bureaucracy a little bit and put more power back into the hands of local leadership. I think another thing that's really important, and that some of the service union workers, SEIU has done really well, and some others, is community building and understanding that the union doesn't just exist as an economic unit, as a collective bargaining unit, but that the role of the union, and if the union hopes to have a political role, it has to be larger than that, because in the end, people make their decisions about politics and how they position themselves on different policy issues, at least in part by through their understanding of their circumstances, their experiences, their surroundings, and that encompasses, in the case of union members, that encompasses their union. And so I would try to reinvest in community building within local unions and give some of the power back to those local leaders as well.
Well, Lainey, thank you so much for being on the Politics Guys, and thank you so much for taking all this time to work through your book.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been so much fun, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad that you wanted to talk about it, really. Oh, no, it's a lot of fun. I always love doing authors, so just thanks for doing that. And again, the book is Rust Belt Union Blues: Why Working Class Voters Are Turning Away from the Democratic Party. And we're going to have a link to purchase that book in the show notes.
So that is it for the show today, and for myself and for Lainey. And I'll just say that as you're heading to the show notes, you should definitely be checking out Lainey's book, but you should also be checking out becoming a supporter of the Politics Guys. Without supporters, we can't make this podcast happen. You get all kind of really cool things like ad-free versions of the show that you're listening to right now, but of course also exclusive shows midweek as well. So if you want to take a look at the book, or you'd like to think about becoming a supporter of the Politics Guys, head on down there to the links and you can click on that, or you can head to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also hit us up on Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys, or through PayPal. But again, the book and supporting the show is all down there in the show notes. If you'd like to get the midweek show, but you're not in a position to financially do that right now, that's not a problem at all. Just reach out to the show at mike@politicsguys.com, and we can get you set up right then. Whether you're a supporter or not, we'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, or review this podcast. And of course, also do the same thing for Lainey's book and share that on social media. If you've got any questions before us, you can always reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. And again, you'll find all of that in the show notes. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Morano, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, and Ivan English. We'll be back with a new episode soon. I hope you'll join us then.